You'll hear people say, oh, charge what you're worth. And I don't necessarily like that, because that's also like, well, it depends on how much you think you're worth. But but it's like, well, no, charge how much you want to make that matches the value you can provide.
Right.
Like, it's kind of a balance of a thing. And so that's something that, when I first started, I would have thought more about kind of that balance of like, okay, what value am I bringing? And then in order to bring that value, kind of how much do I need to make?
Welcome to the Before You Say I Do podcast. This podcast helps wedding couples learn industry secrets about the wedding industry and the various wedding vendors in the DC, Maryland, and Virginia areas. My name is Joshua Buxton, and I am your host. With over 7 years as a professional wedding videographer, I have filmed many weddings all over the United States and hope to help wedding couples find the right vendors before they say I do. Welcome to Before You Say I Do podcast. I am Joshua Buxton with Buxton Media Productions, and today I have Kristy Silva with Weddings by Kristy. Kristy, welcome.
Thank you. Happy to be here. So,
Kristy, tell me a little bit about your business and how long you've been in the wedding industry.
Yeah, so as you said, I'm a wedding planner based in DC, though we do weddings all over, but DC is home. And my business is relatively new as far as when I started Weddings by Kristy and went out on my own in the last year and a half, 2 years now. But prior to that, all of my jobs have been in project management, logistics, operations. That's definitely where my skill set has landed and where I've gravitated toward, but always really connected to the people piece and kind of the service industry, hospitality part of project management and the end result. And that's kind of what got me into weddings, as well as planning my own wedding was part of that as well.
Seems to be pretty typical with wedding planners. They plan their own wedding and they're like, I like this.
Yeah. And it's funny because I hear, other, especially vendors who have been doing this a long time and planners kind of joke or talk down about those like couples, are usually brides, but not always, who are like, oh, I planned my wedding and so now I want to be a wedding planner. And that is kind of, mine, but it did work. I mean, it worked out for me. So I'm like, maybe don't shoot people down so soon. But I think it depends on how well you know the industry, ahead of time. And I knew this was something that I would enjoy and I felt like I would thrive in. And thankfully that's been true. And so now doing this full time as a wedding planner, I've built a team of coordinators who work with me. And so it's been a journey, but I'm loving it.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like a journey. So can you talk a little bit about that transition? That's something I talk with a lot of vendors about is like, how did you transition from, because it was probably part-time at first and then going into full-time, like that transition can be scary.
Absolutely.
But it can be really rewarding to like, now you're doing what you like to do. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I started definitely a part-time side hustle, kind of thing. And it was like, oh, well, we'll see where this goes. And I was really intentional about it, though. Kind of once I had the seed was growing, in my head of owning my own wedding planning business, I really spent the time in thinking about, okay, well, if I was a wedding planner, what kind of planner would I want to be? What is it that I feel like I can bring to the industry that's not there? Like, what gap am I filling with my business? And, kind of use that to develop a good foundation. And then that way, once I was, coming up with a website and, working on marketing and things like that, I had kind of somewhere to go from. And for me, that was about, crafting weddings that are authentic to the couple, especially when it comes to inclusivity and LGBTQ couples. As I planned my own wedding, I was just kind of like overwhelmed with how heteronormative everything was. Yeah. And it was all about brides, brides. Everything's marketed toward brides. And that kind of comes with a lot of assumptions that the groom isn't involved in planning and that the bride's planning the whole thing, or that there is a bride at all, or there is a groom at all in the couple. So a lot of assumptions. And so that was something I knew was going to be core to what I did, was that like, I'm going to be the exception to this that I'm seeing everywhere. I want to feel like a safe space in the wedding industry where couples feel seen. And so that also kind of inspired me to want to keep going. And so as I developed the business, started booking some couples, and their weddings would be in the next year. On my full-time job side, I was getting really burnt out. I was very unhappy, and was feeling kind of more and more eager to leave. But it's a full-time salary with healthcare and retirement.
It's hard to give up sometimes.
The benefits of a 9 to 5,
Yeah,
and so it was hard to be like, okay, well, I'm just going to quit and chase my dreams. So I did both for a while, but my business quickly got to a full-time job. And so then I was just working 2 full-time jobs.
It's not easy.
No,
I've been down that road.
Yeah, not sustainable. Not sustainable. And so I got to the point in, looking at financial projecting and all of that it was like, I could do this. Like I could take this full-time, and also support of, I'm married, so my husband works a stable full-time job. So that also helped, where it's like, if this were to not work out, we do have something to fall back on. But I really wasn't too worried about that. I was like, kind of going in with full optimism and and confidence that, this is what I'm meant to be doing. And I just needed to take the leap. So then I quit my job and fully committed to wedding planning. And it's been great, and a lot better since then, being able to give my full energy and attention to my business instead of trying to split it between 2 jobs.
Yeah, I mean, that definitely is something. I've been down that road, and it's tough, because then you're not giving a lot of energy to your couples either. And you're just like, okay, I'm planning your wedding, but I've got my full-time job and I can only handle this in the evenings or the weekends. And it's tough. It really is. And so making that transition where now that's your full-time job, and you can really dedicate so much time to your couples. That's amazing. Talking a little bit about the inclusivity and something that you're trying to do and break the norm of, like, the bride and the groom and those things. Like, can you talk a little bit about, like, the response that you're getting from couples and how you're doing that? How are you trying to break the norm on that?
Yeah, it's in a lot of small ways, and I've really never outwardly marketed myself as like an LGBTQ planner, and I work with LGBTQ couples, and that's my audience. But kind of in more small ways, being intentional about the language that I use, I think, is the biggest piece. And so, if you read through my website, it's gender neutral. I'm using terms like couples and partner and not bride or groom, and that's true as well on my inquiry form. It doesn't say bride's name, groom's name, which I see all the time on vendor forms. And even my contract, that they signed, the contract is gender neutral, and all of the resources that I share with them are gender neutral or gender inclusive. And it's a lot of avoiding assumptions. So one is not assuming that there's a bride and a groom as part of the couple, but also that that one of them will wear a wedding dress and someone will wear a suit or a tux. Neither of those things are always true either. And then outside of kind of the gender piece, even just things around who's involved in planning, who's paying for it. I think a lot of times there are a lot of couples who have family support paying for the wedding, which is, wonderful. But also a lot of couples are paying for their wedding themselves. So there's not, the family support, and other people, maybe their families really aren't involved at all. They're not close with their families. They might even be estranged from their parents, or people, even kind of on that end having lost parents. And so avoiding assumptions of oh, are you doing a father-daughter dance? It's that might not be the case. We don't know. And so I always, try to keep things neutral and start from that place of no assumptions, where it's are you doing any family or parent dances? Yes or no. And then if they say yes, I go, okay, with who? And kind of those different pieces of just not assuming they're doing something and then they have to tell me, oh, no, we're not doing that. Instead, it's starting from neutrality and building. No,
that's really
from
important.
There.
Yeah, I mean, that's something I've caught myself with, because I used to, in my forms, I would put parent dances, and I just assume that either their parents are still alive or that their parents are going to be there. And I've had one couple reach out to me, and they were really, really nice about it. And they're like, oh, well, my dad passed away. And I'm like, I did not know that. And it's totally changed how I look at that now, because I'm like, I shouldn't assume anything at this point. And I felt terrible. I really did. I was like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. You know, I've had my dad pass away, and it's like, it's not easy.
No,
and it's not an easy thing to bring back up in a wedding.
Especially the wedding.
Especially the wedding. And it's like, those are things that you wish those parents were there. And, you know, so I've changed how I put my forms out there. Now I put special dances, you know, or something, or special dances happening, you know, to include first dance. And there's been weddings where there was no first dance, no dances. And I'm like,
dances
wow,
at all.
Really? And, and it's like, it's really cool how the wedding industry is changing and like what expectations are these days. And what some of the things I'm really enjoying in the day now is like private vows and you know, right. And there are some things that, you know, we as vendors have to be really careful to assume things like we do always assume that brides take the lead when it comes to a wedding, but there are a lot of grooms or other partners out there who are also taking the lead on it. And we shouldn't just assume anything. So I think it's really great that you're kind of taking the lead on this. And I'd actually like be really curious to see some of your forums. So I make sure that we kind of mimic the same thing because I think it's important to take this shift.
Yeah.
So that's really cool. I think that's awesome that you're doing that.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it's one of those things where once you, as like a vendor, think about it and you like, it's not hard.
No,
you know,
it's not. It really isn't. It was a simple form change.
Yes, really simple. But it does take just kind of taking a moment to think about it and to review the language that you're using. And then it's just a habit building of getting, you know, you mentioned like you know, whether it's, you know, having like parent dances or kind of getting in the habit of like asking certain questions, you have to then break those habits. And that's not going to happen overnight. And, you know, and couples are usually very generous and patient and, you know, like with things like that. So it's not something that's going to happen overnight, but, you know, the more that you're intentional about those kinds of things, you know, makes a big difference. And that's also true, you know, thinking about like videography and photography of like, what kind of couples are you showing on your Instagram and on your website? Do they all look the same?
Yeah.
Because then you're kind of telling people, these are the kinds of couples I work with. And if you don't look like this, I only work with couples like you. And they don't feel seen. And so, you know, thinking about all of the whole image that you're putting forward as a vendor and who that will attract.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a really good point, you know, to talk about is, you know, when you are trying to promote yourself in the wedding industry and couples are looking for you, they're looking for things that will mimic or match what they want. And so you have to put not only your best foot forward, but like the diversity of what you can do. Yeah. Otherwise, couples will probably just swipe away and move to the next thing.
Not for me.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's a really good point. So talking about working with vendors, what are some things that wedding couples should be looking for, not only when they're looking for a wedding planner, but like other vendors out there, and how far out should they be looking for these kinds of things?
Yeah, I'd say how far out they should be looking really varies. But I mean, I've seen couples, you know, I've planned weddings in 5 months, but I've also worked with couples for over 2 years. So, you know, and we can kind of get into this later, but I think there's a lot of information that couples are getting from like TikTok that I think is questionable.
Now I'm intrigued.
And, you know, but I think you know, you can plan a wedding at any length of time. I do truly believe that. The more time you give yourself, the more options you'll have. Right. That's kind of what it comes down to.
Yes.
And so, especially with things like venues and thinking about what time of year you're getting married, you know, here in the DMV, DC area, like September, October is like, that's, you know, the height.
That's the peak
of
season.
Wedding season. Yep. So if you want a Saturday in October, you do need to book 2 years out.
You do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like
especially for your venues. Oh my gosh. Venues go quick. I mean, that's the number one thing that usually goes first is everybody's looking for a venue, and then it's usually wedding planner, photographer, and then other vendors as needed.
Yeah. That's what I see as well, is that kind of order. And yeah, and couples don't know that. You know, people tell me all the time, like, "Oh, I wish someone would have told me that the month I wanted is the month that everyone else wanted." Right.
Yeah. They don't realize that,
they don't know that
the peak season for weddings is September, October, late August, just depends, you know, like, and then it starts spreading out further, and or now they got to pick a Sunday or a Friday or a Thursday wedding even.
Yeah, I see Mondays.
Yeah. And so, you know, if you really want that venue, you've got to be thinking out that far, especially in this area. Like, I know different parts of the country, it's like spring is the best, and that's the peak season, but here it's definitely fall time.
Yes.
So if you're a wedding couple out there, you know, just make sure that you're reaching out to your vendors that you really, really want early enough in advance, because otherwise they probably won't be available, and then now you have to go down the line of somebody else, you know.
Yes.
So.
Yeah. And, I tell couples that in this area in particular, it's a pro and a con that it's such a hot wedding market. And there's so many vendors. There is no shortage of venues, photographers, every vendor category.
Yep.
So even like with couples, and they're like, oh, I don't know if I'm doing this on time. Should I have booked this further in advance? I'm like, you'll find a photographer. Mm-hmm. You'll find a hair and makeup artist. Will it be your number one choice? Maybe not, depending on how long you've waited. But you're not going to be able to, you're not going to be in a situation where it's like all the photographers are booked.
Yeah.
That's
thousands of photographers.
So
yeah.
Yeah. And that's also the con, because then couples get really overwhelmed.
Yeah.
Because there's so many options. And so it's like, how do I know where to start? How do I know who to decide to have a conversation with? And that ties back into that, looking at their Instagram and their websites, reading reviews and seeing who resonates with you and who, kind of makes you feel seen and understood as a wedding couple. And then having those, discovery calls, consultation calls, whatever the vendor calls it, and just having those conversations. I always recommend doing those on video or in person if they can. I know most people aren't taking the time to meet up in person for those these days, but at least doing video, it's nice to have a face-to-face conversation.
Yeah. No,
be able to.
That's actually a really good point. Yeah. It's funny. I'm actually starting to see more of that with my couples. They're like, hey, I see you have a studio. Can we see you in person? I'm like, oh, absolutely. Come on down.
Mm-hmm.
I've had a couple of couples that have wanted to come to the studio now and meet in person. I think that's actually better because then you get a real sense of that vendor in person. Yeah. There's a lot that could be said in a phone call, and I feel like you lose a little bit of a connection there. But meeting somebody in person or doing a Zoom chat or Google Meets or whatever, seeing the person, you can actually see expressions and are you really vibing with each other?
Yes.
And that's a huge thing. You want to make sure that you're vibing with your vendor. And I know we talked a little bit before we started recording, but can we talk about how do you find the right vibe with the vendor and why is that important?
Yeah, I think sometimes couples undervalue the vibes, and that is usually how I describe it. Because I've had couples I'm working with, we talked to this videographer, and we had a really good conversation. I don't know how else to describe it except that it felt good. I was like, it was good vibes. And they're like, yeah, it was good vibes. And I was like, okay, good. Trust your gut when it comes to those kinds of things. And your vendor team for your wedding day, these are people who you'll be working together on your wedding day, but also leading up to it. It's the people who you're trusting with the, flow and logistics of your day. And so for vendors like your planner or your coordinator, those are the people you're spending the most time with. So that's definitely number one. You need to like that person.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I think sometimes we're like, oh, it's just I'm hiring a person to do a job, and that's all that matters. But it's no, you do really need to enjoy the time that you spend talking with this person. It's someone who you feel like you can trust to do the things they're going to say that they're going to do. And you can get a pretty good impression of that early. I mean, even after your consultation call, if they say they'll send the proposal to you in 24 hours and then they get it to you a week later.
Yeah.
I mean, you haven't even started working together yet. And
there's already communication problems.
Yes, and things like that. How quickly they get back to you. And also knowing them, we're busy. No, we aren't going to respond to you on a Saturday.
Yeah, especially during peak season.
Yes. So be patient. But also, vendors don't take 2 weeks to respond to an inquiry. This person is hot and eager to work with you. Don't make them
and you're
wait.
losing that client too. As a vendor, I am adamant that I reach back to my clients or potential inquiries within 24 hours. That has always been my goal, if not within hours, because they want to move on something. If they're reaching out to you as a vendor, they want to move on it. Yeah. Whether it's they want to get on a phone call, they want to meet you in person, they want to know more about your services. They want to know right away because they want to plan. Right. And if you hold them up for 2 weeks, good luck getting back to them, actually, as a vendor. More likely they've moved on to somebody else.
Right.
Yeah, somebody else will take them. So, that's a really good point. And talking about trust, that is, I think, really key for couples to understand is you should really trust your vendors because it's your one day, it's your one wedding day. And if you don't trust your photographer, your videographer, your planner, your cake decorator, the venue itself.
Yes.
Like, I would be scared.
Yeah, right.
I would be so nervous if I didn't trust those people.
Yes.
So can you talk a little bit about the why it's important to trust them?
Yeah, that's key. And, so it's your wedding day is one day, and that's why there is kind of this lot of pressure on it and anxiety that comes around it, because there isn't a do-over.
No.
It's it's the day. And so, and for me as a planner, and I think, a lot of vendors would say the same, our goal is that as like the couple enjoys themselves and is able to relax and have fun and just be the guests of honor at their wedding.
Right.
And not the project manager, not the director, and I have a lot of couples come to me where one of them, and it is often a bride, but not always, who actually is a project manager. That's their like job.
Oh, man.
And they're like, I have trouble letting go. And they tell me that on the call, and so like that's why I'm talking to you I want a coordinator, because I know I need to on my wedding day. And I'm like, well, I'm glad you're already thinking about that. So that's good. But, in order to be able to let go and really just trust the process and that everything is going to work out, and that also it's never going to be perfect. It's an event, and there's over 100 people. Like, you can only control so much. There's a million things
happening.
Yeah.
I don't think I've ever seen a perfect wedding.
A perfect wedding, no. But, it's gone perfectly for them,
right.
And when they look back on it, it was perfect, even if we ran a little late, or, this, went off, or whatever the case might be. So it's really that, just like letting go and enjoying it. But like you said, if you don't trust your vendors, you won't be able to do that. And so it's important that your whole vendor team is working as a team. And that's where like the planner comes in. I see myself as kind of the coordinator of like the wedding, but specifically of the vendor team, kind of
right.
directing
Yep.
them and making sure that we're all on the same page and that we're all working towards the same goal, which is giving them a wonderful, amazing wedding day. And so, having vendors who you trust to work with you, but also to play well with others. Like,
that's pivotal.
Yes. And I, as like a planner, thankfully I've pretty much, nothing but positive experiences with the vendors that I've worked with. But there's an exception here and there where some people are difficult to work with. And so, even asking vendors about, like, you could even ask them on the call about like, oh, how do you work with our other vendors? Like, what does that look like? And then they can tell you either, oh, I just kind of do my own thing. Or do they say...
That's a red flag.
Yes, red flag. It's a team. So, instead...
It's a team effort. It really is.
Yeah, and so the answer you want to hear to that is something along the lines of, I make sure that we're collaborating. I'm checking in to make sure we have the same timeline. Maybe saying something like, if you have a planner, be working closely with them. If you don't, maybe you should get one.
I tell if I know that a couple or a wedding couple that is like, oh, I don't have a planner, I was like, please go get one.
Yeah,
like
at least a coordinator.
At least a coordinator, day of coordinator,
Yeah.
month of coordinator, something, because you don't, as a wedding couple, you don't want to have to be stressed out about dealing with all of your vendors, dealing with the timeline, dealing with, oh, the food's running late. Now I've got to figure that out. But you're trying to get married that day.
Yes.
Like, enjoy the day.
Yeah. I think just like couples have, and of course they have no idea. They don't know because they haven't been on this side of it.
Their only time they're getting married.
Yes,
probably,
yeah.
So.
It's also part of our job as vendors is to educate them on these things. But like, I can't even tell you how many questions I get asked on a wedding day. Like, and if I wasn't there, they'd be asking the couple.
Exactly. Yep.
And vendors also don't want to do that. No. They don't want to have to go to you, but if you're the only one with the answer, then they have no choice. Or they don't ask you and they just have to make their best guess. And maybe that is a good guess. Maybe it's not a good guess. And so, yeah. And
it takes them away from doing their job.
Yes.
If they're dealing with videography and somebody's coming up to them asking them a question, or photography and they're like in the middle of a shoot, like now they got to stop what they're doing to go handle this situation and then go back to it. And it's like, we talked about, it's like the wedding planner is like the director of the production, the producer of the production day. And they're the one coordinating every little thing so that everything goes as smooth as possible. Yeah. So that the wedding couple can be stress-free. They can just get from thing to thing to thing and then just actually be in the day and enjoy
in the moment.
Day.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So that's really pivotal to make sure that, one, you have a good team, you can trust them, and that, you think out far enough in advance to make sure that you get the right people,
right?
And those things will make a wedding day so much better.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So, what are some styles you're seeing? Like, what have you seen early on when you first started, and like, what are some new styles that you're starting to see with weddings these days?
As far as different like trends,
Yeah,
and
trends
things like
or
that.
things that couples are asking for.
Yeah, I think there's a lot, and it also varies depending on like the personality of
Right.
the couple. But I feel like at least with the couples I'm working with, are definitely trending more towards simple. That's almost always the word that I hear. I'm sure you probably hear this too. We just want a simple wedding, but also what simple means to you is going to be very different. So it's like, well, that doesn't tell me much, but it gives me an idea of kind of what you're thinking, which usually by that they mean, that they're not looking for like anything grand or show stopping. They're not trying to make a statement. And also wanting, and fun. That's the other word that I hear a lot. More, I feel like, and that couples are bringing up, and a real focus on the guest experience, which I love. That's always a focus for like me as a planner, and tends to be the couples that like I work better with are the ones who want to make sure that obviously they have a good time and that their guests enjoy themselves and aren't maybe as worried about the aesthetics or the look. Like we want it to be pretty, you want it to look nice, but that's not the priority. And so that looks like, bringing in a band, which adds that kind of extra level of engagement. I have a couple who they're having dueling pianos at their wedding,
No way. That's
which I'm
cool.
really excited for.
I like that.
Yeah. And so it's something, something
It's
different.
unique,
Yeah. Bringing in entertainers. I mean, like you can have, I think also couples just don't realize what's possible, but I mean, you can have magicians, you can have like aerial artists, like if you're, I was going to say fire spinners, you have to have a venue that allows some fire spinners, but
maybe outdoors.
Yeah, so it needs to be outdoors. But it's like the possibilities are endless. And now we're seeing, more of the, the live paintings, like the painters who come and will paint your wedding, or the folks who do guest portraits where they'll draw all of your guests, which I think is really sweet.
That's a very good,
that's a good favor.
It's a good touch, like talk about being able to go away from a wedding instead of like a favor that's on a table, like go away with a portrait of yourself. Like that's really cool.
Yeah, like that's something that like they'll actually want to like keep, rather than like
they might actually frame that.
Rather than it's like, oh, good, another koozie, whatever, and like and no
or mints or
yes,
something.
Yeah, and like
I mean those are nice.
Yes, and no offense to people who do that, like if that's what you did for your wedding, especially if that makes sense for like you and your partner, and that has like some significance to you and your guests, and that makes sense. But I think that's part of it also, is like not just having favors, or really honestly not having anything for your wedding that's just for the sake of having it.
Right.
Like I think everything should have a purpose.
Yes.
And if it's not, then get rid of it. It's not like, why is it there?
Right.
And really being intentional about each piece of the wedding, which also, influences budget as well, because it's like, why are you paying for something that isn't meaningful to you? Like put that money somewhere else.
Yeah. So you talk about budgets, and I'm really curious, learning from planners and everything, like how much influence do you have with the couple? Like, do they tell you their budget and you help them like help divvy it out, or how does that work for you? Like, is that something that you offer?
Yeah, with full planning.
Okay.
So for couples who book me for full planning, where we're like, fairly heavily involved from start to finish, it's, we're much more hands-on with the budget. And most couples do come to us with a number, but honestly, like they just made it up. Like
most of the time, yes.
Like, oh, I saw online, this is how much people spend on a wedding.
Yeah.
And so I know, like, I'm starting to see it change now. I think couples are maybe getting a better idea of cost. And then also, of course, as my prices have changed, I, am having couples with different budget ranges.
Right.
But, we see a lot of the like 40 to 50,000 as a budget number I see thrown around a lot. And I think that comes from, the data from, like the knot and things like that, where that is the national average. They're not lying when they say that. You don't live in the national average. You live
not in
in
the DMV
DC.
area. Yeah.
Yes, and that's the other thing. The DMV is like it's one of the most expensive places to get married, and I don't know that couples realize that either. It's up there with New York City, in places that where it costs more money, and so that's why also we see couples go like, kind of more into Virginia or into Maryland rather than DC proper. But, that's all part of that budget conversation that we're having. So they kind of give a number, and then we talk about their vision and what they want, and then kind of comparing them. And so does your vision match your budget? If not, one of them needs to change. Which one of those is flexible? Is your vision flexible or is your budget flexible? And for some couples, it's, our budget is flexible. We're willing to spend more to have what we want. It's like, okay, great, cool. So let's put this together and we'll see what's reasonable. And we'll still try to not blow your original budget out of the water. But it's good to have some flexibility. And for other couples, it's like, this is a pretty hard number for us. And so it's like, okay, so we're going to need to alter that vision a little bit, and let's see what that looks like.
No, that's a really important conversation to have with couples, because a lot of times you're right. Like, they just throw a number out there. They're like, well, I saw this number and I want to stick with that.
And that seems right.
Yeah. And I see that with wedding videography all the time, is like, well, they throw a number and I'm like, that's very low, in this area. It's like, you can get a decent wedding videographer, but you're going to get somebody who's probably inexperienced, who's done like 1 or 2 weddings. And that's what you're going to get. So we always have this conversation of the value that we're offering. And once they understand like what is it that they want out of the day, and we talk a little bit about the budget, I'm like, this is what we can get you that, but it's at this price range, but what you're getting is years of experience and hundreds of weddings filmed, I think that is a key thing that couples need to definitely understand, is like, you do have a budget, and like, be open-minded to like, we will give you what we can for your vision, but it may not be in your price range. But if you have a hard set thing, like, now we have to scale back. And what can we scale back? What are you acceptable with? You know? And so they're not easy conversations to have with couples, but they're important ones, and something you should definitely have with your vendors up front. Absolutely.
Yeah. Because there's a vendor for every budget. Yes. Like you said.
There is.
Like, if you only want to spend, like, I mean, I see people, you see in the Facebook groups and things, like, looking for a videographer, my budget is $500. You're like, oh.
Cringes.
But their vendors comment and they say, I will do it. There's people, and usually, like you said, they're new, they're trying to get into the industry, build their portfolio, which is great. And so if you're okay with that, then
you understand that you're going to get somebody who shows up, who's maybe filmed 1 or 2 weddings. Just be prepared.
Yes.
And coming from experience, who filmed weddings early on, you might forget to hit record, and you might forget to hit the record on a lav mic, or the light falls over, or, all these things happen. But with experience, and reason why they cost more is because I've made all those mistakes and I don't do them anymore. So like, I have backups to the backups now. So and that does come with experience. And I've seen videographers who are happy to offer $500 services, and and I do try to make sure that we offer, like, I will work with a lot of budgets, but there are like some like minimums that we have to hit. It's like, I can, I have a couple that just locked us in for next year, who they just want the ceremony. I was like, okay, that's not normal what we offer, but let's see what we can, what makes sense for us to do this and lose a day, because that's essentially what we're doing, is like, I'm losing the potential of a higher client to be able to do this for you, but I'm happy to do it, but it's got to be at a price point, like, okay, so we'll only be there for 2 hours, and I'm only sending 1 videographer then, versus a team of people for 8 hours, it's just a different product. But it's like, I think it's really important to work with couples if they do have a budget and they have some parameters, but be understanding that we still have to make it work for us too. It's a business,
Yes, it's a business.
It is a business. Like, as much as I enjoy weddings, it's still a business. I have to pay people.
It does pay my bills. Like, I have to
pay for electricity. So it's definitely a business. I mean, that's an interesting thing. Like, I think wedding couples should understand more, this is a business for us, and like, can you talk a little bit more about that? Maybe, I know this is, within the last 2 years, you've really taken this off as a business, so can you talk a little bit more about, that this is a business, but there's an emotional side to it as well. So, to the couples,
and I truly believe, and I feel like maybe some vendors need to hear this also, which is that, like, for the wedding industry, I truly believe your heart has to be in it. And I'm not someone who thinks like, you have to love your job. Everyone needs to love their job. In the wedding industry, I do kind of believe that. Because it's an emotional business. We're not planning a work conference, like
corporate event.
Yeah, a corporate event where, like, people are invested in it, but also they do one every year. And if it doesn't go as planned this year, they'll do better next year. That's not how weddings work.
It's not.
People are emotionally invested, and so are the guests. They're emotionally invested. The parents are, and so there's just like that piece of it. And so as vendors, I think, like, we kind of need to give that same commitment to like our work. But with that, in order to do that, we need to make money
Right.
so that we can keep having a business. I mean, I needed to be able to charge enough that I could quit my full-time job,
Right.
and so that way I wasn't working 2 jobs, allowing me to give more attention to couples. And then now, as, you raise kind of prices every year, and as, you get more experience, you raise your prices, like you mentioned. And, for me, like my ultimate like goal is that like I'm charging more and then taking on less clients.
Right.
And so then the couples are getting even more of my attention because I don't have to book as many in order to hit, these financial goals versus, those like when vendors are charging $1,000, it's like, okay, well, are you working 60 weddings?
Right. And how much time can you really devote to that?
To each one. Yeah. And so I think that's something also that often when you're paying for vendors who are at a higher price point, you're usually also paying for more attention from them because they probably are taking on less weddings a year than someone with a lower price point. And so that's something I think that, couples might not think about, but is important as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really, really good point. Well, so the last question I always like to bring up, with all of our guests is, what is something that you wish you could have told yourself when you first started in this industry?
That's a good question. When I first started, I wish I would have charged more. I think, I don't know that I regret it, kind of starting at such a low price point because it's what allows you to start somewhere and to build your business. But you quickly realize just like the amount of work that goes into it, not just on the wedding day, but everything beforehand. And so, you'll hear people say, like, oh, charge what you're worth. And I don't necessarily like that because that's also like, well, it depends on how much you think you're worth. But but it's like, well, no, charge how much you want to make that matches the value you can provide.
Right.
Like it's kind of a balance of a thing. And so that's something that, when I first started, I would have thought more about kind of that balance of like, okay, what value am I bringing? And then in order to bring that value, kind of how much do I need to make? And kind of going from that perspective rather than thinking about it more from on a per hour basis. I feel like, you can do the hourly math, but it's also hard to do because like I'm not just doing the hourly math for a wedding day.
Yeah.
I'm putting hundreds of hours into weddings before the wedding day. So that's hard to calculate.
Very common misconception. They think they just have you for the day, but oh my gosh, there's so many hours before and after.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much, Kristy, for being here on this podcast. And where can people reach you and like find more about what you do and what you offer?
Yeah, so I'm Weddings by Kristy everywhere. So Instagram, TikTok, and then my website is weddingsbykristy.com. But always available either in the Instagram, DMs, email, website, inquiry form, always open.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Before You Say I Do podcast. Make sure to subscribe, like, and follow our YouTube channel and podcast platforms.